Welcome to Law, Life, and Liberty with Anthony Puopolo.
Welcome to Law, Life, and Liberty with Anthony Puopolo. Anthony G. Puopolo II is a Massachusetts attorney who helps families navigate divorce, custody disputes, and criminal charges that often overlap. With offices in Lowell and North Andover, he's represented clients across Middlesex, Essex, and Suffolk counties in both family and criminal courts. I'm Lisa Mosby, and today we're talking about parenting plans in real life and why 50-50 isn't always the default. Anthony, welcome back.
Thanks, Lisa. Nice to see you again.
Anthony, how often do you find that most people who come to see you assume that there will be a 50-50 split when it comes to custody of their children?
I would say probably 80 to 90% of the time. I think it largely depends if we are talking about a married couple versus a couple that had children out of wedlock, how long they were together. Particularly in a case where the people are out of wedlock, did they live together with the child? Because if they live together with the child, there's usually much more of a feeling, well, I've always been there, it should be 50-50. So I would say it's a large percentage of my clients who believe that that's the default.
And then in what scenarios does a 50-50 plan actually increase parental conflict rather than resolve it?
I think it's often when I've seen clients with where it creates more conflict is they tried to do their agreement themselves. They said, we're just going to share plans without clear guidelines on what those plans are. People who try to think that they're able to work together by swapping days and they don't keep good track of whose time is whose, and then they wind up fighting over, no, that's really my weekend. So having unclear plans, I would say, is the number one issue. You really do need to define exactly whose time is whose, and you have to know yourself and your significant other or former significant other well enough to know whether or not you're going to be able to work collaboratively for if there needs to be a swap and make sure that it's not something that's just going to wind up turning into a fight.
Anthony, what are the specific best interest factors our local judges prioritize when deviating from a 50-50 schedule?
So there's a lot of factors that the court is going to look at. They're going to look at who spent a larger chunk of the time with the child, who has more of a bond with the child, who nurtured the child, how old the child is, what are the activities the child's involved in, which parent has had more involvement in those activities. Because ultimately, the goal for the family court, a colleague of mine once called it, and I think it's very aptly stated, the court of status quo. We want to try to keep things as seamless for the child as possible. We don't want major disruptions, so we really want to look at what was the life of the child with each parent to determine what the most appropriate parenting schedule would be.
And you mentioned that 80 to 90% of the time, the parents think that it would be a 50-50 split. And I understand it always depends on the circumstances, but in reality, is it 80% of the time that happens, or is it far less than that? Can you kind of give us a framework of so folks can understand what truly happens in these cases, that it's not always a 50-50 split, and to assume that might get you in trouble?
I would say that part of my job is setting appropriate expectations. I would definitely say that, yes, it is far less than 80% of my clients who will land on a 50-50 schedule. Hopefully, both people are able to work well together and agree that 50-50 is in the child's best interests. But there's a lot of factors. Did the former significant other move a substantial distance away? What is the schedule for each parent? I have a case right now where I have an executive who's constantly working, constantly traveling, and that's not good for the child because the court really wants to make sure consistency is the most important thing for a child. And we need to know, what is your schedule? What's your availability? Can you be there for the times you've signed up for? And, what are the things that you've done with the child to make sure that the child is still with the parent that they've developed the closest bond with? So I would say it's probably closer to 50%, maybe even 40% of the ones that really land at a 50-50. And those are divorces. Typically in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, depending on how long the unwed couple was together, the unwed cases typically tend to land in an every other weekend scenario much more commonly, unless they were together. I have a case right now where the unwed couple was together for 9 years. they're at a 50-50 because essentially that's half the child's life where they've been with both parent. But most of my cases of unwed parents, they were really only together maybe a year and a half, and the likelihood is they'll wind up with the biological parent, in most cases, the mother, the one who gave birth to the child.
You mentioned the availability of the parent. How does the court evaluate geographic viability if one parent lives significantly further from the child's school and extracurricular activities?
That parent is very likely going to have much less parenting time because I had a case actually where it was only about a 35-minute distance between mother and father. Father had the custody of the children at the time. Mother wanted a 50-50, and the judge said, I am not going to make a child commute 30 minutes to school. So in that case, mother wound up having every other weekend because it's not, in the court's view, best for the child to have to. We're going to spend plenty of our lives commuting. A child shouldn't have to be doing that. So geographic viability is a problem when you are not close enough to your child to feasibly not have it be a burden on the child. And that really does depend on the age of the child. In that case, the children were 8 and 9. Versus, I think a court might be a little bit more willing to do it if you're dealing with teenagers, but it is certainly a factor a judge is going to look at.
And again, back on that availability, how do unpredictable and demanding work schedules, like you mentioned previously, maybe on-call medical or even frequent travel, influence a judge's willingness to order equal time?
That really is going to be a factor you're going to very much have to demonstrate to the judge how you are able to carve out the time while still being able to meet the demands of your work schedule. And it's not going to be enough. I've had clients who say, I will make it work. That's not going to be enough for a judge. They're going to want to know, what exactly is your schedule? When are you on call? Are you on call 24/7? Because that's going to be a problem. And maybe that can be mitigated if the other side is in agreement, if you're close enough together. But a judge is going to look at someone who's on-call medical is a great example. What if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you get called to the emergency room? Who's going to take the child? So that is problematic, and you're really going to want to develop a very strong plan for how you can accommodate your work while also accommodating what should be the priority, which is your child and your child's well-being.
And you said proof or prove it. What evidence would that require to prove that one parent has historically been the primary caregiver and maintaining this continuity is better for the child than trying to accommodate a 50-50 split?
So things that the court will look at will be, especially if one parent says, I have been closer to the child than the other, and there's a disagreement, the court can appoint what's called a guardian ad litem, which is an investigator, which would be appointed by the court to investigate things like who's more actively involved. The guardian ad litem might interview teachers, doctors, coaches, the people in the child's life who can testify as to who they see more often. I have a case right now where my evidence really is, look at all of these doctor's visits where I have the medical notes that say father was present. That's one thing that you can document. I've been at every. IEPs are a big one, which are plans for persons with developmental disabilities. I just had a case yesterday in court where father just doesn't attend the IEPs. And my argument to the judge is, how can he be actively involved with this child if he doesn't know the child's medical needs? So it is really important to be able to document your level of involvement with all of your child's activities, medical, extracurricular, all of it.
And then at what age or maturity level do local courts begin to heavily weigh a child's own preference for their living arrangements?
So I would say facetiously 18. The court's never going to put the child on the stand. Unless there's some major reason to appoint a lawyer to that child, the judge is only going to hear from the parents. And the reality is, we're not going to come back to court every other week because a child says, I want to live with dad. Oh, I just got in a fight with dad. I want to live with mom. 14 to 16 is where there may be, if there's a mechanism to get their voice into the court, where the court might consider it. But the reality is, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, your child doesn't make decisions until you're 18. I had a case where my client was the mother. She was a relatively small-framed woman. Her 17-year-old son, football player, refused to go to his father's. Her father held her in contempt for not sending the son to his parenting time. The judge turned to her and said, "Why didn't you?" My client said, "What am I supposed to do, assault my son and force him into the car? He's twice my size." And the judge said, "No, I expect you to be the parent. The child doesn't make the choice. You tell him what he does." It may not feel practical in reality, but that is unfortunately what some judges will look at. Not all. Some might be a little bit more understanding. But the reality is your child doesn't make the choices. The courts will expect you to be the parent and explain to the child why this is not optional.
And then how does the court handle a 50-50 request when there is a documented history of poor communication or parallel parenting needs?
So there is definitely a difference between legal custody and physical custody. If we're talking about 50-50 request in terms of legal custody, because differences in parenting are not going to impact parenting time. But legal custody, if there is a clear inability of the parties to communicate, then the courts will consider granting one party sole legal custody versus the other. If the parties are actually able to agree, the court can order what's called a parenting coordinator, which is, a third party that will help them with disputes. But the court can't order that. The parties have to agree that they're willing to do it, then the court can order it. But the court on its own can't just order that. So the reality is, if you guys cannot communicate with one another, the court is going to be faced with the hard decision of saying that only one person gets to make the choices.
And Anthony, where I want to wrap this up today is if we start with an unequal split, what step-up provisions can be included to transition toward a more equal time schedule for each parent in the future?
So I think it largely depends on whether we're talking about an agreement between the parties versus a judicial order. A judge generally is not going to include, if you went to trial and a judge issued an order, your parenting time is going to be your parenting time. And they're generally not going to say, if this goes well for 6 months, you can come back and we'll make a change. They're going to be looking for a material change in circumstances. The parenting plan that they wrote for you is the parenting plan, which is why it's always preferable to try to find a way to negotiate and settle, because you can be more nuanced in that case. So I had a case with one side having some fairly substantial drug problems that they were actively working on sobriety, and we were able to come to a written agreement, and we were able to say, after 6 months of clean drug tests, there will be overnights. 6 months from that, we will consider an every other week schedule. But on its own, a court's not going to get that nuanced. So if you go to trial, you're going to get what you're going to get. And then you have to depend on there being some kind of material change down the line and go back to court again. It won't happen by automatic operation of the order, which is why being able to do that yourselves in an agreement is always the best way to do it.
Anthony, thank you so much for your insights today. I think that you've opened our eyes to some new information. That's it for today's episode of Law, Life, and Liberty with Anthony Puopolo. To learn more about Anthony G. Puopolo across Massachusetts family and criminal courts, visit agplawoffices.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to subscribe, share, and leave a review so more Massachusetts families can find the guidance they need. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.